Welcome back to For All Kerbalkind. As our massive Saturn V rockets take their painful time to complete, our program still has missions to perform and things to look over between lunar landing missions. We have far too much money sitting around idly, so we'll be spending a total of 2.5 million funds on upgrading our research and build speeds here at our main facility. Beardy and I agreed to set a few rules now that the initial space race is over and the cash money begins to roll in. From sounding rockets to landing on the moon is what I consider to be Phase 1 of Realism Overhaul. After making it this far, Phase 2 begins, where money becomes abundant and the game really opens up into a sandbox of sorts. To keep us from simply snowballing like crazy, we've set some limitations. Our main space center cannot exceed 25 BP per second build speed, secondary space centers cannot exceed 2.5 BP per second build speed, and R&D cannot exceed 2.5 science per day. I am still a few $1 million away from reaching these limits, but I'd like to keep some cash in the bank for now. We'll be needing it soon, considering more robust station parts are on the R&D menu, coming to a VAB near you in 1966. The Soviets have researched these already and are likely going to be up to no good with them, so it's a good idea for us to begin upgrading our long-term presence in space. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For now, we've got some smaller missions to perform while we wait. September 21st, 1965. The small network of 4 Synkom 2 satellites, launched in January earlier this year, has been nothing but problematic from day one of its mission. Satellites A through D are all dead at this point in time, but their replacements, satellites E through F, are ready for flight on the Pathfinder E rocket. The Foundation aims to have a stable network up and running before an upcoming Venus transfer window in just over 1 month's time. Given our reputation of shoddy communications performing interplanetary burns, we're really hoping these work out better than the last batch. Sun high in the sky above Wallops, Virginia, Pathfinder bursts into life. The flight trajectory for today's liftoff is a high-reaching arc, which, although more inefficient for traditional launches, allows our second stage adequate time to practically burn horizontally for its entire initial burn into orbit. Separation goes swimmingly, apart from an ullage motor explosion, but it has no effect on the vehicle, which keeps charging onwards. Pathfinder is in orbit. Synkom G and H will remain attached to the upper stage until its apoapsis of 4,000 kilometers. At this point, it will be time to circularize the orbits. Due to the chosen orbit, spacing out the 2 satellites initially is a very simple set of maneuvers. The 2 satellites are detached and follow their own flight paths. Synkom G will circularize its orbit now, while Synkom H will wait 1 orbit in its eccentric parking orbit before following suit. This allows both satellites to reach a 4,000 kilometer orbit with a minimal eccentricity and to be spaced out rather nicely. It won't be until the liftoff of the next 2 satellites that we'll need to fine-tune their relative distances to one another if we choose to do so. But for now, they wait. Contrast to the first Synkom satellites, G and H indicate healthy power and communication connection to each other and mission control on the ground. As for the small network, we're halfway there. September 26, 1965. Morning arrives 5 days later, and the next 2 satellites are ready to board 1 more Pathfinder E launch vehicle. A sunny, cloudless day sets the stage as ground teams wait for Synkom 2G to be in position. We'll be targeting a direct-to-position launch for the satellites, admittedly eyeballing the process, so we'll see how close we can get. Engines light, and we're away. Pathfinder E has performed perfectly. Taking a look at Synkom's relative position to the other 2 satellites at the initial apogee, it looks like we're in a good position for separation. At the time being, minimal correction is needed. Satellite E detaches and burns to circularize its orbit after reaching slightly above 4,000 kilometers altitude. The orbit won't be perfectly circular, but slight eccentricity will have no effect on station keeping so long as the orbital period is exactly the same as the other satellites in the network. Period is the key to keeping things in the same place relative to one another. Everything else can be as imperfect as desired, within reason. Synkom F, the final satellite of the small network, will wait in its eccentric parking orbit for 3 more revolutions, passing by G and H each time before burning to complete its own orbital insertion. Once again aiming for a relatively similar altitude, but ensuring a perfect orbital period with the other 3. Well, all 4 satellites are in place. We could very well spend some time aligning these satellites perfectly with one another, but as their operational lifespan may only last for a handful of years due to solar panel degradation, I feel that their current position is more than adequate. Plus, our attention is much needed elsewhere. So, mission success. Back at Wallops, Virginia, we've decided it's time to massively upgrade our capabilities and infrastructure. A 700-ton pad begins construction, and $1 million funds are spent on increasing the build speed to 1.9. This is close to our limit of 2.5 here, with just a little bit more room for improvement later on as well. 4 Atlas D Kentaur launch vehicles begin development as well, without a specific mission yet in mind. Perhaps lunar or geostationary satellites. We'll just have to wait and see. September 28th, 1965. Our attention now turns to another planet, Mars. Last episode, Markiner 4 arrived, capturing into a very loose orbit as a small lander descended to the surface. If it weren't for a shoddy aeroshell deployment, the lander would be operational on the surface and not mooning the Earth for the rest of its existence. Markiner 4's mission continues on, however. After flying past Phobos and Deimos for the first time, I think it's about time we get ourselves a little bit closer. The fuel on board is only enough to propulsively reach orbit of 1 moon. But we've got a little trick up our sleeve thanks to Mars being an atmospheric planet, and a tame one at that. Markiner will perform a number of aerobraking maneuvers to slow ourselves down, lowering our orbit practically for free. The goal here is to dip low enough for the atmospheric drag to slow us down as much as possible, without going too low that we start to melt the spacecraft. This vehicle was not designed for this purpose, necessarily, so it will be interesting to see the results. For our first pass, we will choose an 80-kilometer perierion, and see what happens. We'll face retrograde to keep our instruments out of heat's way, and thank our solar panels for being nice flat surfaces, monitoring our critical temp percentage more than anything. At this point, there really isn't anything we can do to stop ourselves from overheating. Attempting to brute force increase our altitude in an orbit's periapsis is the most inefficient method of doing so. So, nope. We're just along for the ride, monitoring rapidly changing numbers. Here's hoping. And we're through the thick of it, with great success. I'm impressed with how effective that maneuver was, actually. We could send anything towards Mars and capture into orbit for absolutely free, so long as we have connection with Earth and survive the ordeal. Luckily for us, at this point in Mars's orbit and our orbit, the Earth hangs high above the horizon line during the aero passes, so everything is lined up very nicely. Our initial 189,000 kilometer apoarion with an 11-day orbital period has been reduced to 62,000 in 2 days. Very, very effective. We'll simply continue this process for as long as it takes to reach an adequate apoarion to reach our first target, that being Deimos. After a few passes, our apoarion is quite close to 20,000 kilometers, the altitude at which Deimos orbits Mars. At this point, it will only take 30-some meters per second to propulsively match this, rather than risking an overshoot with another aerobrake pass. It would have taken roughly 900 meters per second to use our engine rather than using Mars' atmosphere, so the savings speak for itself here. Now, all we'll have to do is time an intercept with Deimos wherever possible. The only real constraint here we have is time. In 19 days or so, a launch window from the Earth to Venus will be available, and we have another Markiner probe, similar to this one, getting ready to go. As I can't effectively pilot 2 missions at once, we'll aim to reach Deimos sometime before then. Plenty of time to do so. Despite Kerbal Space Program entirely hiding encounters from us, we've established a rendezvous course with Deimos, needing a simple 12-second burn to capture into orbit once arrived. This was calculated simply by judging our distance at Apoerion from Deimos's at its current position. Deimos's orbital period is 30 hours, and if we circularize our orbit here, we will forever be behind Deimos roughly 7 hours or so, just by eyeballing it. So all we have to do is adjust our orbital period. If we become 7 hours faster than Deimos around Mars, bada boom, we will reach Deimos with ease. Sure enough, this worked perfectly, and adding a blank 0 meters per second maneuver node somewhere down the line finally displays our encounter as well. Perfect. One small burn later, and we've captured into orbit of Deimos with a blazing orbital velocity of 2.5 meters per second. It won't take much fuel to adjust our orbit from here at all. Either gravitational anomalies or something to do with persistent rotation mods seems to cause our solar panel alignment to go out of whack in only a few hours, needing adjustment twice every orbit of Deimos to continue to power systems, which, due to solar panel degradation, means we must limit sending our data whenever possible. And although floating around this space rock at such a slow speed is quite fun, our adventure doesn't stop here. A small burst from the RCS thrusters puts us on a collision course with the moon. Yep, with how little fuel it takes, we are absolutely going to take a quick trip down to the surface. Landing on Deimos is more similar to rendezvous and soft docking with the celestial body than landing on, say, our Earth's moon. The gravity here is so weak that our plan of action has to be to stop our velocity inches from the surface, then wait for us to slowly settle. We will spend a few hours here on the surface, analyzing some telemetry and utilizing the onboard camera to photograph the terrain where we've landed. Monitoring the orbit, it seems we'll have good connection with the Earth as well as great sunlight to charge up our batteries for the entire time. The date is now October 10th, 1965, and it's a peaceful moment among the cosmos, really. After a short while, it's time for Markiner 4 to return to orbit of Deimos. Using a science experiment as a sort of spring, the spacecraft hops to over 1 kilometer's altitude before a short burst from RCS thrusters puts us back on course. Now on to our second target, Phobos. This moon is much closer to Mars than Deimos is, with an orbital period of only 7.5 hours. From where we are now, aerobraking is likely not the most efficient method of reaching our target anymore, so a simple transfer between the moons is all that's necessary. I've chosen to perform this at our earliest Phobos descending node rather than attempting a direct transfer between the moons, just for the extra simplicity of it really. Using our same method of intercepting Deimos, we are a few hours behind Phobos at our perihelion. And all we'll need to do after some quick maths is to make sure our orbital period is roughly 13 hours, and an intersection is guaranteed. Now in transit to Phobos, we encounter a bit of a problem. Somebody back home forgot to instruct Markiner 4 to reorient its solar panels after the latest burn. And well, the batteries have run dry. Thanks to ever so slight wobbliness, eventually we do regain full control. But not before frantic attempts at getting Markiner 4's reaction wheel to spin the craft just a little bit faster. Nonetheless, batteries charging once more, we are on final approach to Mars's closer moon. Our relative speed is much higher this time around. We'll have to burn just short of 40 seconds to reach orbit of Deimos, but we've got plenty of fuel for it nonetheless. Once captured, it is evident Phobos' gravity is twice that of Deimos, coming in at a whopping orbital velocity of 5 meters per second. Once again, our mission will take us to the surface of the small potato-shaped moon, but this time we're going to have to be a lot more careful. Not with our fuel, but with our time. Phobos is very near to Mars, and Mars is going to very regularly be in our way. Markiner 4's batteries can't last very long without direct sunlight, and can't perform any maneuvers or adjustments without line of sight of the Earth. Both of these are going to be blocked 3 times a day on a regular basis while we stay here. It's not difficult to plan maneuvers around these restraints, but it is another layer of planning that we have to pay attention to if we don't want the spacecraft tumbling out of control towards certain doom. We plan a short burst of RCS before the Martian eclipse, after which we will end up approaching the surface just after the eclipse. That is, as long as I timed things correctly. Regaining connection with the Earth, light from the sun follows soon afterwards, and one small adjustment later, we're on our way to the surface. RCS is once again more than enough to slow our descent and bring us to a soft landing on the surface. This time around, we descended straight down and opt to reach the surface like a top rather than at a shallow angle. Performed with ease, now the reaction wheel can orient our orbiter-turned lander to slowly tip over towards the sun, allowing the very weak gravity to settle our final position over time. The date is now October 12th, 1965, and Markiner 4 has successfully landed on both Deimos and Phobos. After dropping off an almost successful Mars lander, I'd like to call this mission a great success. We definitely beat the Soviets to this goal, but much more importantly, 2 of our contracts have now been completed. In fact, this entire mission completed 4 or 5 of them. This will twofold bring in funds directly and open new contracts to be accepted. One step closer to maxing out our launch facilities to match the capabilities of the Soviet Union at the current time. And speaking of, we have a feeling they might be up to something. Intel suggests some top-secret Soviet shenanigans are afoot, and we'll be wanting to see what we can find out. For now, though, it's decided to allow Markiner 4 to rest a while on this moon. Every 7 hours or so, direct sunlight will provide some power to the spacecraft, and should we ever need to utilize it again, we will be able to, panel degradation willing, of course. Active mission now complete. Markiner 4 signing off. Back at the Space Center, we've got a few more contracts to grab, starting with some obvious ones. The next in line for crewed lunar landings coupled with a flight of 3 crew, and then a major contract. The next milestone for our series, and very possibly the next leg in our race into space, the Lunar Surface Outpost. We won't be able to build this right away. Just as with the crewed landings, we've devised some prerequisites. Namely, completing all of the crewed landing contracts, putting up an orbital surveyor, and of course having appropriate tech nodes unlocked. The future on the moon is going to get quite interesting. Additionally, we're going to have to push back the deadline of a lunar orbit contract since our Trinity missions take such a long time to construct. But speaking of, it's about time we spend some of this cash. 2 million funds going into the R&D, bringing our technology speed almost to its maximum. And then we'll spend another 2 million funds to upgrade our build speeds. Now here we have to be a little careful not to exceed the maximum of 25 BP per second cumulatively. Pulling out the calculator for the last dozen points or so, making sure we don't go over, it turns out 2 million was the exact amount of funds needed to fill them up. All 3 lines adding up to 24.9975 BP per second. Until the foreseeable future, we'll be working with these numbers, and a lot more funds will be going towards more expensive vehicles and infrastructure rather than speed. After some thought, I decided to also fill up the R&D speed too, just to get that out of the way. Money doesn't do anything sitting around, and those tech nodes tend to be time sensitive. You never know when a few days could really matter down the line. October 21st, 1965. Brownsville, Texas readies for launch operations as the next Markiner probe, Markiner 5, awaits for its journey. We are a few days ahead of a Venus transfer window, and in the shadow of Markiner 4's success and failures, some changes have been made to the lander that we'll talk about later on. Early in the morning before sunrise, the Titan 3 lights its mighty boosters. Markiner 5 reaches orbit of the Earth with no major problems during liftoff, and all that's left is to plot a course for Venus and let the Kentaur transfer stage do all the hard work for us. Kentaur performs perfectly. Markiner 5 detached, orients its panels, and gets ready for its interplanetary voyage. In 175 days, we will arrive at Venus, and the small lander will attempt to survive the atmospheric plunge while Markiner captures into orbit. Without any small moons to visit, there will be less to do here, but it's an important mission regardless. We'll perform a correction burn someplace along the way to fine-tune our approach, but as for now, we're all ready to go. The Kentaur stage has become the backbone of many programs for us, and this mission, it proves it's entirely outperforming what we require it to do. Plenty of fuel is left over after the transvenusian injection, and given the current phase of the moon, we can perform a small burn to bring the transfer stage to an impact trajectory. This will minimize orbital debris, and more so, I find it kind of fun. November 26, 1965. The KX-2003 DynaSpy has been standing by at the launch facility for merely a week's time when intel reports something suspicious. All signs point towards the completed construction of an N1 rocket, without any infrastructure, chatter, or any other information evident of a crewed flight that we can find. The United States once again orders us to send our available vehicle to spy on the Soviet launch site to determine if this vehicle is a threat to national security. So, Neil Kerman climbs aboard, ready for flight. Following separation from the Chiton 3, one of the orbital engines experiences a problem: performance loss. It's burning at half the thrust with half the efficiency as expected. Nevertheless, the engine does run. With 1.5 engines, the vehicle is able to make orbit without issue. The targeted inclination for today's flight is between 60 and 100 degrees in order to best run our photographic experiment mechanically. Last flight, we were unable to gather any science as we were below this mark, and I did not want to risk using the engines more than I needed to. On this flight, our engines have been a problem, so it's good that we're already at 60.4 degrees inclination already. The only burn we'll have to perform is one that gets us home. We'll get to fly over Baikonur several times during the mission, both during the day and at night. What Neil witnesses through observation equipment on board is the launch of a completely unannounced N1 rocket on the 27th, in the middle of the night. This justifies Neil breaking radio silence to communicate back home. With our Synkom network finally up and running, he can do so at practically any point in his orbit. The next pass over Baikonur during the day shows something unexpected. Another rocket on the pad, a Proton launch vehicle with a launch escape tower fitted on the top. This comes with relief, but additional concerns as well. The N-1 rocket was likely not some sort of mass destruction weapon the Pentagon always thinks it is, but more likely some sort of habitation. We know the Soviets' previous attempt at completing a 30-day stay in orbit to fulfill a contract did not succeed due to power troubles, so this could very well be an unpublicized attempt to complete it again, or given the use of an entire N-1 rocket, maybe it's something much more capable. It won't be until several days later that we find out the truth from a Soviet television broadcast. A crew of 2 cosmonauts is aboard a spacecraft known as Rogatka, and of all things, they are on their way to Venus. That comes with an initial shock, and a completely unexpected answer to the question that's been on everyone's minds the past few days. 2 brave Kerbals have dared to venture out away from the Earth, further than any Kerbal has ever gone before, to fly around Earth's sister planet and return. So many questions come to light. Will the crew survive? Have the Soviets fixed their problems with orbital power supply? Will radiation around Venus be lethal to the crew? None of these we will know, but are very, very eager to discover. And should the crew come back alive victoriously, it will be a great experiment the United States will learn much from as well, without having to risk Kerbonauts of their own. Which, by the way, our own Kerbonauts are not too happy to hear the news. There's a sense of pride in being first to the moon after such a long time coming, and now they almost feel like it didn't mean much at all. The daredevil test pilots and spacefarers want to go further, push harder, and well, we may do just that should the Soviets continue to outpace us like this. For now, we wish the brave Kerbals on board Rogatka a safe journey, as we witness Neil Kerman splashing down into the Gulf of Mexico a few days prior to this news that we're talking about now. Yeah, our re-entry was just a bit of an overshoot, and I realized it a little bit too late. But hey, we're in one piece, and any landing you can walk away from is a good one. That's all for this episode. Thank you all so much for watching. A special thank you to Darth Malachor, Dake Raybon, Elliot Ewing, Guy Called Odin, Caden Seward, and everybody else on the Patreon for your support. Have a wonderful night, and peace out.